everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming despite this potentially dry topic on the New Mexico rare plant conservation strategy. Obviously, you're the diehards that are truly interested in what is going on with rare plants in New Mexico, or what should be going on with rare plants in New Mexico, and what is the status of rare plants in New Mexico. So the rare plant conservation strategy was adopted from what the wildlife people have been doing for years now, for at least a decade. All the wildlife agencies in every state in the United States have a wildlife conservation strategy or a wildlife action plan, which basically proposes a list of animals, in this case, of greatest conservation need. So animals that are not yet listed, and the idea is to do something for these species before they even need to get listed. The wildlife agencies have to produce this wildlife action plan because it's directly associated with a large sum of funding that helps with the conservation of the species listed in the wildlife action plan. State of New Mexico, for example, gets $1 million for species of greatest conservation concern, so species that are not game species. Wouldn't it be nice to have that for rare plants? Yes. That's what I thought. So, unfortunately, there is no money available for rare plant conservation in New Mexico or anywhere in the country, or hardly any. For example, that all the money that is, the federal money that is available for recovery of endangered plants, so federally listed plants and animals, only 4% goes to plants, even though over 60% of all listed species are plants. So there's a very strong taxonomic bias. Nonetheless, I thought it would be a really good idea to have a conservation strategy for plants, something similar to what the animal people have, because it can still help getting funding, because you have actually something documented, written, that is a problem, and that provides guidance and priorities for rare plants. So New Mexico at this point, because we have a rare plant conservation strategy, is on the forefront in the country. Only 2 other states or 3 other states have rare plant conservation strategies, and one of them is Colorado. So as you all might well be aware of the fact that New Mexico is one of the most biologically diverse states in the country and ranks fourth highest in plant diversity in the country. We have over 4,000 species documented, 109 of which are endemic to the state, and they don't occur anywhere else but in New Mexico. Clearly, we have reason to be concerned, and we should be doing something about our rare plants. So this is just a tiny sweep of plants that do only occur in New Mexico. So we have identified 4 major issues that afflict, I guess, rare plant conservation in New Mexico. And number 1 is the lack of baseline information. We've identified 235 rare plants in New Mexico, and we have like maybe 30, maybe I want to say 30 at the most, have somewhat, no, actually we've got 50 that have adequate information that we can give it a conservation status, for example. Most of them, we only know that they're there. For example, here in the Taos Chapter, there's 2 new species that were described in 2012 from the alpine areas. We only know that they're there. We do not know the extent of the populations. We don't know if there's 100 out there or 1,000, and whether they occur anywhere up there above the tree line or just in this one particular area from which they were described. So there's a strong lack of baseline information, and in the absence of baseline, you can't make any kind of statement about whether a plant is rare truly rare or endangered. And the other one, of course, is the lack of botanical expertise. New Mexico almost has no botanists in the agencies. There is no botanist anywhere in the Taos or the Carson National Forest, for example. There's one botanist on the Lincoln, and that's it. So there's really nobody around that you can ask about plants. Perhaps you can ask them about trees. The Fish and Wildlife Service has no botanist on staff in New Mexico, even though they have 13 listed species. They make decisions about the status of these plants and whether they should be listed or not at all times without actually having expertise on staff that helps them. The BLM is doing a little bit better, but they cannot really, most of their funding for the botany program comes from seeds. And so they spend probably 90% of their time collecting seeds and working on that funding source. Of course, that all combines with the lack of funding. There is apparently no funding to hire botanists in the agencies, and there is no money going towards rare plant conservation. The only true funding in New Mexico for rare plants is through Section 6 of the Endangered Species Act, which funds the Rare and Endangered Plant Program or my position. So there is no other money available in New Mexico for rare plants. And all of that is more likely than not due to the fact that there's a very strong correlation with what the Fish and Wildlife Service calls the inadequacy of regulatory mechanisms. The laws, even the federal laws and the state laws, don't really protect plants. And so there is no money directed towards plants. So plants are protected differently from animals under the Endangered Species Act. There's a state law protecting endangered plants in New Mexico, but it really only protects plants from collection. So you can go out and you can plow them under, but you cannot take them off the property. So if there is no real rules and regulations, then there is no incentive to fund anything or hire botanists. So, but this is a problem that's been recognized by the few botanists and plant enthusiasts for a long, long time. And so we decided at some point that it would be a really good idea to come up with a strategy to help guide plant conservation in New Mexico. And so we formed a partnership between various agencies and interested parties or stakeholders to help with the management of rare plant species, primarily to avoid federal listing. So that is the overall goal of this strategy. And this is the list of our current partners. So these agencies and groups were directly involved with writing the strategies, and they had all input on what is important and what would help conserving rare plants in New Mexico. So the purpose of the strategy is to provide guidance to regulatory agencies as well as land managers to secure rare plant species by increasing the protection, improving data on status and the distribution of plants, providing management guidelines, increasing the coordination between land managers and conservation partners, promoting education and stewardship opportunities, and facilitating on-ground conservation and recovery actions. So there are three primary components to the strategy. There's the strategy itself, which is this document, and I'm going to go over each one of those components to some detail. There's a rare plant scorecard, and then there's the important plant areas map. So first I'm going to talk about the document in itself, and I just put out some of the things that you can find in the strategy. Of course, there's the purpose, then it lays out what the actual status of rare plants is in New Mexico, what are our challenges to rare plant conservation. The core, of course, is the goals and the objectives. Then we have how we're going to implement it, and what are our measures of success. And some recommendations on where to go from here, because the strategy is actually a rather overwhelming document. There's no end of things that can be done. So we prioritized some of the actions on things that we thought would be most important to get to right away. And then we have, of course, a list of appendices and some explanations on how the scorecard and the important plant areas were derived. So we set 7 very specific goals that we thought would get us to where we would like to be with rare plants, and that various agencies or stakeholders can participate depending on their abilities. Number 1, of course, is inventory, monitoring, and research, the strategy species. So to inform management and regulatory agencies. If you don't know what you have and what its distribution or threats are, I don't know how to ever make important management decisions. Then, of course, once we have identified the locations and whether plants are actually rare or not, we need to protect them, manage them, and properly restore the habitats. I think data management is really something that's come up over the last, I want to say, 15, 20 years. And it still is in its infancy. So before that, 20 years ago, when we actually still had botanists out there, they were collecting a lot of data, for example, but it just ended up in some drawer. Botanists were not replaced in the agencies, and we don't know where that data is now, or what happened to it. That's now called legacy data. I think the Forest Service is having some effort to try to dig that out, but it's been 20 years, and at this point that information would be considered historical. I consider all information pre-GPS historical, because the sites are just incredibly difficult to find without GPS coordinates, and so you depend on how well somebody could read a map. But anyways, we need better data management, so if we have staff turnover, for example, we still have the record that anybody can access, or if there's a project going in, like a power line or a baseball field, whatever, somebody could just access a database and see if there could be potentially issues with rare and endangered plants. And that kind of data needs to be shared with everybody. And then we were looking at developing some ex situ conservation and recovery strategies and implement them where appropriate. Some of our rare plants are so extremely rare, they only occur over, like the Holy Ghost Ipomopsis in the Santa Fe National Forest only occurs over 1.5 miles of a road, and is seriously endangered by the various road improvement projects that the Forest Service is implementing there. So we want to make sure there are some other populations in case something happens to the one that you have, like with the Holy Ghost Ipomopsis, the 2013 Tres Lagunas fires came within a couple hundred feet of the only one population. So we could have potentially lost it. So we really want to work on some ex situ conservation, which means collecting seeds, growing out some plants in botanical gardens for conservation purposes, but also growing out plants to start additional populations. Then, of course, we really need to improve laws, regulations, and policies. Particularly the state law, which does not protect plants to the degree that they need protections, and we also need to develop some policies. And we also need to be working more on increasing collaborations, not just within the agencies, among the agencies, but also with other stakeholders that have an interest in rare plant conservation, such as the Native Plant Society, or even artists, and schools, and academia. All of that, of course, we hope to be able to improve funding for infrastructure and also rare plant programs, like the rare plant program in New Mexico right now is a one-woman show, and that's for the entire state of New Mexico, and that's just utterly inadequate, and the agencies just don't have anybody that's really looking at rare plants. So the strategy is available, this document, and everything that I'm talking about is available through 2 websites, the New Mexico State Forestry website, as well as the New Mexico Natural Heritage Program website. So I don't want to get too deep into this because there's a lot of information in the strategy, but this is the core. We have, what did I say, 7 goals. We have 7 goals, and then under each goal, we list a set of objectives. So, for example, with the first goal, the inventory and monitoring goal, we have a total set of 5 objectives. And under each objective, we actually listed action items that we feel need to be done to properly conserve endangered plants. So the first thing we had to do when we developed this strategy, of course, was to determine which plants should be in the strategy. And we finally developed a list of 235 plant species that we consider rare in New Mexico. So that includes all of the ones that are considered endemic, all federally listed species, all state listed species, the Navajo Nation listed species, the ones that occur in New Mexico, 36 BLM species, 64 Forest Service sensitive species, and then all of the rare plant species that you can find on the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council website. So it's all comprehensive and even larger than the rare plant website species. And this is really whittling it down. I know that back in 1998, when we were developing the list for the rare plant website, we were at 600 species. And that was just too overwhelming of a number, but I feel really good about the 235 now.
Can you identify those plants, those flowers?
Holy Ghost Ipomopsis,
Right.
Sacramento Mountain Stitzel, Totson pennyroyal, Gooding's onion, Mesa Verde cactus, and Asticillia. All of them extremely rare. Some of them federally listed. So the second component and an integral part of the strategy is this rare plant conservation scorecard. It's basically an analysis of the current status of the 235 strategy species. So we took the database, the heritage database, and all the information that we knew about the 235 species and put them in a spreadsheet and list for each species the threats, the degree of protection that they receive, a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm going to show that to you in a minute. Actions needed to conserve the species, and it also sets a score, a conservation score, on whether we think that something is adequately protected or not. So this is a tool that we see that land managers can use directly to determine what needs to be done for the species that occur within their management unit. Okay, so then the scorecard is called a scorecard because it includes all those various scores that tells us about the status. So there's a biodiversity score, which is based on range, landscape, integrity, the number of occurrences that a species has, and what kind of protection it gets. The threat scores, of course, based on documented threats. A protection score is something inside a national park or in federal land or private land. And then it gives it a conservation status based on those scores. Okay, then it includes also information on what is the range of the species in New Mexico, which ecoregion it is in, what is the land ownership, the agency status, oil and gas potential, or whether there's oil and gas development in that area, wind potential, mining, and grazing. And then because we actually don't have all of that information for all 235 species, we had to do a set of lists. We had to divide them up into these 4 lists depending on how much information we had for a species. So list A has the most information available, where we could actually give it a good score. List B, we were not so confident about whether we had enough information to give it a conservation score. And then list C is those that we really don't have enough information to give it a conservation status. So those are really the ones, as far as I'm concerned, that we need to work on because we don't know anything about it. And then we have a list D that may be, for example, a species that's locally common endemic. Like our mountain ranges in southern New Mexico have a lot of these species that occur in these what we call sky islands. They might be locally common throughout the Sacramentos, for example, but they don't occur anywhere else in the world. So we feel that they're secure right now in their current management. We don't need additional management or protection, but they're still on the list because on a global scale, they're still rare. This is what the scorecard looks like.
Wow.
So can we click on that link up there and access actually a live version?
Jim, how do I make this fit?
Yep, you're getting
Yeah.
There you go.
Get the weather forecast.
Oh, you're getting the weather for some reason.
Did you?
What's on the other tab?
Can we go somewhere else?
Looks like
Let's rain tonight. We already had some at our house.
Yeah, scattered.
12 drops.
We had 0.04 of an inch. All right, that obviously.
What's in the other tab?
Oh, that's my inbox.
Oh,
Can I copy it?
well,
Yeah, I don't know why.
I don't know what.
Try
Control
copying.
copy it. Oops, I did that. So, I guess the answer is no, it doesn't take us where we want to go. Oh, I just didn't have the right touch. Okay, so, over here. That's not a tablet.
So this is the this is the Rare Plant Conservation Strategy website. I'm going to open up the scorecard that you can download. How do I get this full screen?
Just double click up there. That'll help.
Double click up there.
At the top. One low down below that.
Yeah.
There.
Oh,
That killed it.
What is this new
It's better.
okay, so here are 235 species, and they're all listed here for convenience. So if you just look for one particular species, they're here alphabetically listed, and it will tell you which list it is on. So let's say we have an A-listed plant here. This plant, first one in the row here, is currently being evaluated by the Fish and Wildlife Service for listing. It's called the Leoncita Falls Foxglove. So it has the rank that the Natural Heritage Program assigns it. Then it has a bunch of various scores depending on how common it is, and it all comes out with a biodiversity score. The orange basically means moderate, green is good, and red is you should be concerned. This is for the biodiversity score, as well as the protection score, and then it has an overall conservation status that is calculated from those other things that we know about it. Another important one is that we have the number of known populations. And so anyways, all the information that is known about a rare plant is on this scorecard, and it's a lot of information, but if you're a land manager, I think it's very useful. So then it comes up with what are the threats that we know that are the documented threats, and do we consider that a high, medium, or low threat factor? And then I have to put on my glasses. Okay. So, and then over here, we'll let you know how confident we are in that score, depending on what data we have. Again, a lot of our species have not such great detailed data that we can even make such a statement. Another important one for managers, so if you're a land manager, let's say you're the BLM, and you're really only interested in what's on the BLM, you can sort this list by BLM status or federal status. Is it federally listed or not? Does it have a BLM status? Does it have a Forest Service status? So you can actually just wind that down to your management unit and what you need to do. So then it tells you how much of it is on BLM, Forest Service, or any of the other agencies in private land, and what we know is a potential threat in those areas. There's a lot of information here.
It's a lot of data.
There's all the data on rare plants is now available for everybody.
How long did it take? How many meetings?
It was a monumental effort.
Well, yes.
I would not want to repeat.
Did you start on this when you came here, which was
No,
what,
this was done in 2016 and 2017.
over 2 years?
Yeah. So it did the list, so originated with the Heritage Program and the data they had, and then all the species specialists that wanted to reviewed the list and contributed stuff that they knew. It was very intense.
Yes.
You know, I have like other states now inquire about developing a rare plant conservation strategy. Telling them, and it's a labor of love. Because this was done on a shoestring budget. and a lot of love. We're, how do I get that?
Okay. Okay, that was you wanted to be back in? Or, oh, okay.
Okay, so that's the scorecard. I consider the scorecard really fundamental for land managers on a species-specific level. Okay, the third and very important aspect to the strategy is that we developed this map that basically highlights where all our hotspots are for rare plants in New Mexico, again, based on heritage data, and then we gave it a rank, you know, a biodiversity rank, mostly based on the number of occurrences that something had in the state and how endangered it was. So this is a very, really, realistically, a very coarse map, but it does tell you where our hotspots are and how important they are. So some of them are like tiny, like this one up here, because that species only occurs there. And some of them are really large, because there's a whole bunch of species and we basically just drew polygons around observations.
And these are occurrences of the rare species.
Yes, we're talking about the 235 strategy species.
So there's 3 of the outstanding ones that looks like in Taos County.
Yeah.
Pretty dark green.
Yeah.
So one is probably the alpine, the mountains.
Okay, well, hold on.
Okay. Oh, we're gonna focus.
So we're going to go back to the website now.
Oh, jeez.
So if you are so we created this map and we created an interactive map because we had a great GIS person for a while. So you can go to our website and get this interactive map of the rare plant, important plant areas in New Mexico. You can zoom in on an area. So each important plant area has a name and the number associated with it. It tells you which counties it occurs in and the number of species in each area.
Of the 235.
Yeah, so right now we have the Chama watershed, which is one of yours. There's 13 species in the Chama watershed important plant area, and it has the highest biodiversity rank there is. It's huge. So then you can come over here. So the closer you get in, then it actually tells you the names right there. And then you can add the legend on what it means. You can add different layers. Like I work a lot with wildfire and I'm really concerned about some of our rare plants and their response to these mega fires that we've been having, since they can impact the entire range of a species. You can look at add land ownership, and you can add the ecoregions. And if you zoom in even closer, you can get the public land survey system in there to tell you township range section. So, in addition to that, if you're truly, truly interested, I can provide you the shape files with these important plant areas that will also actually list the species that are in that area. That information is not available on the web because we want to be a little careful with you know, what we put out there. I mean, some of them are really small and they have one species that might be a collectible species, so we don't want to tell everybody.
That's amazing.
So I don't know how to zoom up. So just want to, I personally really like the wildfire history. You see here the Gila? Most of the Gila is gone. And most of the Gila where most of our rare plants are. So it's a very interesting mapping project. So can we go back to
PowerPoint?
Do you have the dates of each fire in your database?
yes. So this is only the big fires.
Right.
There's lots more fires than that. But I think if you click on that, it will actually tell you the name of the fire and the acreage and the year. So here is, for example, an example of an important plant area. This is the Guadalupe Brokoff Mountains important plant area. It's 438,000 acres, has 18 species, and it's one of those outstanding ones. So because these areas are purely based on the number of species that we could get into a polygon and the reality on the ground and the reality of getting like 438 acres protected for rare plants is pretty slim. This is really just, this is not anything that says you need to protect the entire 438 acres. This is a suggestion where our hotspots are for rare plants. It does not take into consideration, for example, land ownership. But if, for example, we're working with the Gila chapter on their important plant areas, their forest management plan is currently being updated, and the Gila chapter requested the important plant area shapefiles, and they're working directly with the Forest Service to designate some important plant areas for special management consideration in the Gila and their revised plan. There could be ACECs, which is a protection designation by the BLM. Could be just a nature preserve or biological preserve. The state has nature preserves. Nature Conservancy has nature preserves. So this is just a tool to help identify where the hotspots are, and if an agency is interested to pursue that further, you know, then you would really go in and try to figure out what the actual distribution of the rare plant species is that you want to protect within your management unit. There's no doubt it's not like the entire areas are occupied by rare plants. So we don't just develop all of that so it ends up in somebody's store and nobody ever uses it again. So we want the strategy to be used. We want it to be used, particularly by land managers that have influence on how rare plants are being conserved on their land. So we establish these measures of success. We want people to act on it, and these are the measures that we've come up with to determine whether the strategy is actually being used and whether it's functioning. So it gives us a measure of accountability. It appears that people need to be reminded that they really should be doing something to conserve their rare plants. So every 5 years, I think we said, we're gonna have, so the strategy just came out last year, and I think we're gonna have our first real big meeting sometime this winter, where we invite anybody, not just the partners, but anybody that could be a potential partner, or that has an interest or is a stakeholder in rare plant conservation. We're going to present the strategy to them, but we also, after that, we're going to have annual meetings where we'd like all of the partners to bring in their data on what was done for rare plant conservation purposes. But because the strategy is obviously a bit of an overwhelming document, and you could easily just shove it aside and say it's more than we can handle, we did establish this list of 10 priority actions of things that we think need to be done now or on a consistent basis and ongoing. So I put these are our 10 priorities, and I put little stars and thumbs up on where I think where we're at. So we established a list of conservation priority species. That's the scorecard. So that was a big one, so that gets thumbs up and 2 stars, because it's done. We did good. Baseline is something that needs to be collected on an ongoing, continuing basis. I do a lot of that. I collect a lot of baseline of rare and endangered plants throughout New Mexico, but I'm the only one. Okay? So I have to give myself a star. Really unique agencies to kick in on that one significantly more. And then provide the maps. That's the important plant areas maps, and that's done too. So that's working. And this is, just 1 year in. Provide botanical expertise within the land management agencies, as well as the regulatory agencies. It has nothing. So nobody's hired a new position as a botanist. I think the BLM is actually doing okay, considering, but again, they can't really use their staff that they have for rare plant management. They tried to do some monitoring, and they've done a pretty good job, but the Fish and Wildlife Service, despite us pleading with them repeatedly over decades now to hire a botanist, still doesn't have a botanist, but we keep at it. And the same is true for the Forest Service. Then, this, give that any star. Well, we are working with I get a lot of requests for the important plant areas, and people that are doing any kind of management or have an interest in management have requested shapefiles. And again, we're working with the HELA, and I'm hoping that the HELA is going to actually use the important plant areas to delineate what we call conservation opportunity areas, or what they might call research natural areas or botanical areas, some type of special management areas. So we are working on this, and we are hoping that, especially right now where a lot of the resource management plans and are being updated within the BLM as well as the Forest Service. Then, of course, working with public agencies to collect and share the best data. I think that is an ongoing thing, but I also think it has improved over the last 5 years. People really need to learn that we need to talk to each other, and we really need to educate some of the agencies that they need to involve some botanists in the discussion about how to manage their rare plants. We have done, I think, we have improved greatly with data management and working with the Heritage Program. The Heritage Program, for those of you who are not familiar with it, they collect all of the data that is found on rare and endangered plants and animals throughout the state, regardless of management boundaries. So they're basically the central spot for all of that data. That way you can evaluate, for example, for endangerment based on a species level rather than on a management unit. We're still working on this website, so we put the strategy, of course, and the important plant areas map and the scorecard on our website, the forestry website, The same is true for heritage. They put the strategy, the scorecard, and the important plant areas map on their website, but they don't have the interactive map, only we do. But we're really working with the heritage program to actually establish a website just for the strategy that is much more comprehensive than what it is right now. We want to roll in, for example, the rare plant website that currently everybody is using, as well as provide PDFs of all of the great literature that is being produced on rare plants, such as status reports and monitoring reports, best management practices, survey guidelines, so that anybody, any place that needs that kind of information has one place to go to. And then this is kind of somewhat of a generic task here to take conservation actions towards recovery of rare species. That largely applies to plants that we know that are in decline, that we need to recover from the endangered species list where they're already on. I do a lot of that with some of our federally listed species. And some of the agencies, certainly the BLM does now as well. Seed banking is something that we've been talking about for years, but it still hasn't been done. And then we also have not yet generated a research list to guide project proposals for potential graduate students. I used to work out at NAU, and there was always a bunch of graduate students that were looking for projects. And the professors did not necessarily know what could be a good project that could be actually used for rare plant conservation. And I think that the few botanists that we have in the state could really help out by directly working with academia and suggesting some projects that need to be done that would make great graduate student projects. So, it's not just the agencies. I think everybody can participate in rare plant conservation if they have an interest. It always takes that one special person that has that interest and that driving force. In Santa Fe, for example, there's two guys got really interested in Santa Fe cholla and the conservation of Santa Fe cholla, and at the beginning they just thought growing them out and then sticking them in people's yard would be conservation until they found me. I found them, and now we have established these conservation sites for the Santa Fe cholla in 3 different locations where they're protected in perpetuity because the natural occurring populations are all in really dire straits, and again, they're not really protected. But through community action and interest, we now have, they grew out hundreds and hundreds of Santa Fe cholla. And then I help them along with the monitoring. So we're actually experimenting. Do they better establish when they're watered? Do they need water or not? Should we put them into cages in the first year to keep the rodents from eating them? How many should we plant? Should we weed them to start out with? So we're doing all these experiments, pretty cool. And can we start with tiny ones, or is it better to start with big ones? So I have like a serious research project on the Santa Fe cholla because a couple of people took a strong interest in it. So that's what we call citizen science. I've variously led groups, particularly through the Native Plant Society, to help them identify a rare species in hopes that they would adopt it and then maybe go out if they wander around the woods, for example, to if they find the plant, to report it in. Or to go back to known sites, what I call the historic sites, and see if the plants are still there, get us some GPS coordinates and some kind of an estimate on the number of plants. Of course, there's always this, the participating and commenting in the resource management plans that are currently being updated. Like I said, the Gila chapter is very involved in that, and I don't know, I don't even know if the Carson is updating theirs or they're
Yeah,
already
they're-
done.
Currently working on
They're working on it.
opportunity.
Opportunity, because they really don't know anything about plants. It's remarkable. You look at what they're writing about rare plants, and it's clearly just something that was developed for animals. It just doesn't work with plants. Then, of course, there are even drier documents than forest management plans at the Federal Register, but they were making some very, very important decisions on whether something should be protected federally or not. And again, there is very, very few botanists in the Fish and Wildlife Service nationwide and none in New Mexico. I'm going to say that seriously shows in the Federal Register documents. I write pages and pages of comments to those people. And I don't know if it makes a difference. Then, of course, participate in strategy, recovery, and rare plant meetings. Rare plant meetings have been going on since 1997. Currently, so we're going to have one of those too this winter at some point. Right now, they're only happening every other year. They used to be every year. Some species, like the Holy Ghost Eye Pomopsis, have recovery meetings. Those are the federally listed species, where the Fish and Wildlife Service pulls together a group of knowledgeable or interested folks that really want to participate in getting the plant off the endangered species list through various recovery or conservation actions. And then starting this year, we're going to have annual strategy meetings where we update each other about what's going on with rare plants in the state. I'm going to guess that the strategy and the rare plant meetings are going to be combined. And then, of course, promote rare plant conservation in schools, public events, newsletters. People ought to be made aware that we have a very interesting flora with some very rare species and that they are in need of conservation. So here I just pulled out another example for Taos. This is from the New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council website. This is the most commonly used website in New Mexico when it comes to rare plant. You can do a search by county, and it will list you all of the plants that are considered rare by the Technical Council in Taos County. Or you can pull them all, but I just pulled the ones for Taos, and then we have an abstract and a description for each plant and photos and their habitat. Doesn't include all the 235 strategy species yet, but about 200 species. So that includes these two. This is Penstemon bleaklii, and this is Draba henricii. Okay, so Penstemon bleaklii is hot off the press. It was just added last week. This is only known from Taos County, from high to upper elevations. That is all we know about this plant. So if you're in the habit of wandering around up in those upper elevations beyond the tree line, you might want to keep an eye out for this plant. If you carry a GPS, great. If you don't carry a GPS, maybe you can tell me on a map where it was. Take a picture, get an idea of, I don't know what the abundance is of that. Is it truly rare? Is it just overlooked? You got to be out there at the right time of year. And the same is true for this Draba. This Draba both of them were described new to science in 2012. Okay, this one came on our list in 2016, and this one just last week. That one is only known from Fraser Mountain. We don't know it to occur anywhere else right now, but look at that. It is easily overlooked, clearly. So, but if you do, go hiking at the right time of year and you see it, we would really like to hear about it.
You're saying that in all of New Mexico, that plant is only known to be on Fraser?
Yep.
Wow.
It is not known anywhere else. And the same is true, this is only known from one location. I don't remember which mountain it was directly on the Colorado border. It could occur in Colorado, but nobody's ever documented in Colorado. So things are that rare and they're that little known. I know that the BLM has done some work with the Astragalus ripley and Semopteris spellenbergii. So that's BLM land, a little bit lower elevations, but we don't really have a good idea of the distribution or status of any of those. I mean, there's plenty of work to go around. There's no end to it, you know, if you want to adopt a plant. And there's a lot of different things that can be done, anything from monitoring to just documenting historic population, going all the way to documenting new populations, especially these ones that have been relatively recently described. Okay, so I could clearly talk your head off about rare plants, but I want to go to bed too. So if you have any questions or concerns or want to help out or have seen some rare plant sightings, want to get more involved, you can always contact me. I can easily be found by just looking for Endangered Plant Program New Mexico or New Mexico State Forestry. All of my reports, so I write on an annual basis status reports and monitoring reports on some of our rare species and those that I'm investigating. All of that is found on our website. So if you have an interest in a particular species, you know, like the Holy Ghost Hypomopsis or Knowlton's cactus, for example, we've been monitoring that for over 30 years. So we got a huge report on it. And then the strategy is also available through Heritage, who has and they have a whole bunch of information as well on their plants. So, thank you.
Thank you. We do have a botanist in the BLM office here, Lillis.
Yes, I know.
But,
So
yeah.
BLM is the only one, the
Yeah.
only agencies that does actually pretty well. They have a state botanist, and then they have Patrick Alexander and Lillis. And they have somebody in the Carlsbad office as well.
Right.
But they're all funded through the Seeds of Success program.
Right,
So that's their priority.
right.
That's what they have to focus on. But the state botanist, Zoe, she's giving a talk on rare plant management to the Santa Fe chapter
I
tonight.
saw that, that's it, yeah.
She tries what she can to use her crews to at least do some monitoring on some of their endangered plants, because the BLM is supposed to be the monitoring agency, so they're doing some work with rare plants, and I know Lillis has done some work with Semopteris spellenbergii and Astragalus ripley.
Oh, actually, okay.
So they have some more up-to-date information. So that is new, that we actually have a botanist doing some rare plant work in BLM
Yeah.
here. But I think it's only a term position.
Any other questions? Comments?
So for citizen scientists out there, what kind of information can we gather on these rare plants that would be useful to you? Besides like just occurrence and number, what other data are you looking for?
Well, it depends on what species. So some species, we really would like to know about trend, which then you would actually go back to the same site and monitor the same population year after year to see if it's going up or down, or if it's stable. We like to have information on threat. So with climate change, for example, previously all those species that occur up in the alpine area, they were just thought to be secure because they're up there where nobody does anything. But now with climate change, we're really worried about these plants and what that does over the long run. So I think it would be helpful, well, if you're physically able, if we had some monitoring plots in some of the alpine areas with some of those really rare species. But for the most part, with the rare species in the alpine areas, we really would like to start out with just having an idea of what the actual distribution is and how abundant it is, and whether you observe any threats. Do you see any bugs on them? You know, is a trail running through them? Is there a cattle trough on them? stuff like that. So there's really some very baseline information, but it depends on your abilities, on your ability to travel, like the Santa Fe Cholla, that's literally in people's backyard. Things can be done in a day, it doesn't require overnight or backpack or going up into the Alpines for 5 miles, so it totally depends. So if you have an interest in a species or do something, you can look at the list, for example, and see if any of those species strike your interest, and then you can strike up a conversation with me and I can tell you what would be a good thing to do. Seed collecting is another one of those. We should really collect seeds in case these things go extinct, because they might, and store them in one of those facilities that specializes in this, just in case it does go extinct. That requires a lot of observations, you don't know exactly when the seeds are ready. So you have to do multiple trips out there to see. Sometimes they're not ready at the time when you think they should be. Sometimes they're already done. I'm currently working on a reproductive study on Holy Ghost hypomopsis. And that just kind of develops seed pods as it goes along, so some of them are not ready and other ones are completely done. And then they disperse their seeds like instantly. I wouldn't want to be a seed collector, it's maddening, but that is something you could do locally when you have the time to just, if there's something in the area, run out and take your dog for a walk, and see how the seeds are developing when they're ready. That would be very simple and very useful.
Have you connected any connection with the Nature's Notebook program of the National Phenology Network?
No.
Well, there's a National Phenology Network, and phenology is the study of natural phenomena like bud burst and leaf drop, or when things seed, and people keep track of, say, one thing, like, a rare plant, when does it go to seed, by visiting it every day and making these notations over years. That's how we know that, birds are migrating at different times now, and plants are ripening or blooming later or earlier, depending on where they are. But they have this program called Nature's Notebook that you can find on their website. It's been going for 10 years now, and it's true citizen science, where you really determine, I'm going to study this patch of land here that I walk, every week with my dog or whatever, and observe what's going on there with a lot of things, or one thing in particular. I've always thought it would be great to get the group going on something like that. Just pick a species or pick a space and
A group where you can pick an important plant area and do
Right.
inventory in an important plant area.
yeah.
What we've documented in there, but could use some more thorough investigation.
Hi, Daniela. I met you before when you were describing the Gila studies and then the Navajo reservation. My name's Sylvia Raines Dennis, and I've done a lot of rare plant work in the Rocky Mountains, and I worked for Colorado and northern Arizona. And I've been here for 20 years, taught classes that included these subjects at UNM-Taos. And there's been, I could bombard you with observations and comments, but there's two things I'd like to suggest in front of this group. One is that in Colorado, they have a rare plant symposium, and that is worked into the annual meeting. It's the day before the annual meeting, and it's an entire day of workshops, and I attended, it happened last week. I attended the year before, and while they were presenting on Colorado's rare flora, all these plants that also occur in central northern New Mexico are on their map. So they're starting to get curious about the extent of the range, and of course one of the big impacts on the alpine species is the climate shifts. So we're seeing populations disappear, and we're seeing disjunction in populations that used to be contiguous. And some of the data in our area was collected by the Rocky Mountain Herbarium staff up in Wyoming. So some of the data from Valle Vidal and the botanical natural areas. So you might find some up there. The Carson National Forest awarded a botany contract to them. And I went in there and I said, well, we would like to know what's here already. Because I think what happens is Taos falls through the gap because we're in the middle of an eco-regional overlap, and they're not counting us with the Rocky Mountains farther, or the Four Corners, or the southern.
No, I think, are you familiar with SINET?
Well, I mean, the databases are better, but like the landscape conservation strategies and the watch list, like we just kind of drop right off the map so they don't get used for the management plans, and they don't end up like the environmental studies are
Well,
just.
that's why we developed the strategy,
Yeah.
so that they don't just drop off, and it does include everything we know about rare plants in New Mexico, including Taos. It does not include Colorado. Colorado has significantly more data and rare plant botanists on staff. Our heritage program doesn't have a botanist. I mean, really
Yeah.
is just me. And so, I would like to have, for example, a rare plant symposium where people actually present their work that they've been doing with rare plants, and for people to exchange information. I think that would be great. Right now, we just have the Rare Plant Technical Council meeting, which has changed in nature since I've come along, and I've been more inclusive with inviting everybody that has an interest in rare plants, and we have a little rare plant roundtable discussion about everybody's issues in their various agencies or whatever it is that where they're working with, or where their interest lies in rare plants. But and then there's going to be the strategy meeting. It's just that I just haven't found a way to clone myself yet.
Well,
That's what it comes down to.
Yeah,
So
I'm
that's why I'm looking for volunteers. So I could would go a long ways if I could have some help pulling a meeting together, arranging a meeting space, inviting everybody, and all those things. It's just, and that's again why we developed the strategies, because we need more people. We need more people on the ground. We need more people in the schools. We need to get more out to the public. And the data sharing is a big item too. And actually my strategy was developed originally based on the Colorado strategy. So I did work with the heritage program up there, and it's very similar to what they have going, just designed for New Mexico issues.
So if there were a watch list or something that we could, what I'm looking for is teeth before the land conversion occurs, because we're having habitats that are extremely unique converted overnight under county permitting and no review, and we have shortcutting of NEPA on federal sites with no review. We have no botanists to verify it, but sometimes they make a determination or a record of decision, and you're probably commenting in the Federal Register on some of those decisions, but it's too late. The land's been converted, the habitat's gone. These are extremely rare populations, very little was known. Sometimes the populations didn't emerge from the seed bank for several years because of drought or fire. So these are things that I think what I've worked with elsewhere, even in states as low in population and resources as North Dakota, is they give you a watch list and they say, before you go about your land converting, you need to clear your development site for these species.
Now, there is actually some tools available for that, so that the New Mexico Game and Fish Department just put out an environmental review tool. It's brand new. You
Okay.
can find it through the Heritage website. You
Okay.
can go in there and you can map your project, and it will give you a list of animals or their species of greatest conservation need, and it includes the rare plant list, the scorecard list, and they're going to add the important plant areas layer. So if you have a project, you can easily, with that tool, you can use that tool and easily identify the species that could potentially occur in your area. It makes it really easy. The problem is the inadequacy of regulatory mechanisms. Okay? So yeah, you have this list of species, but there's no law that says you have to do a review. There's no law that says you have to address these species or avoid these species or in some which way mitigate. even if they're federally listed, they get away with the no effect determination. So that's why one of the main goals in the strategy is addressing that gap and try to strengthen our law. Now, I do know that there's currently an effort in the state to come up with a state NEPA law, but I've been prohibited from participating. So,
You're not allowed to participate?
called off by the governor.
Well, and this is, I get told, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, well, how come all these laws apply in Arizona, Texas, and Colorado? You know,
Well, there's
this is-
federal laws and then there's state laws, but the ER tool will at least get you to say that this has been provided by Game and Fish, so you have some solid
Yeah, I didn't know
information.
about the
It's fairly new.
Yeah.
So there are definitely people that are trying to make things better, but there's a lot of pushback on regulations.
So if anybody were interested in the Taos chapter in doing a little work group or something on a symposium, I'd be really happy to coordinate it or help in any way I can, because this is an emergency here. And we are in the part of the state that has the alpine and the furthest end of the range of all these other ecoregions. And we're the refugia for species that are fleeing other habitats because of grass fires in Texas and drought in the south and extreme temperature regimes and lack of pollinators. We're getting the species here. And then we're also the reservoir for species migrating out. So if their habitat disappears here, it's a conservation crisis. So I'm sorry if that's too much jargon, but that's what we're sitting on.
It is a conservation crisis and we need people on the ground that pay attention. Because things can literally go extinct from under our eyes.
Exactly.
Especially with the mega fires now too.
And thank you for your work.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure Daniela